Do God's promises still remain? That's the question before us, and that was really the thought process of God's children when the book of 1 Chronicles was written. Right? It's a historical book for a people that were just restored back into the land, back into the community. And it's a reflective book to look at the promises of God and really asking the question again, do these promises still remain for us today? And so I love 1 Chronicles. I encourage you to read through it. It's kind of hard to read through because it is an editorial. There's genealogies, there's a bunch of other just lists. But the question, right, do his promises still remain? And we could talk about the promises then, and the one promise that we see being passed on from David to Solomon is a promise that God gave a man named Joshua hundreds of years earlier, where David says to his son, "Be strong and courageous, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is going to be with you." That's a promise, right? God with you. And so the question before us, as we consider 1 Chronicles, is today, 2023, right? Do God's promises still remain? Right? What promises, you might ask? Right? I think a promise that you and I need to consider is, does his promise still remain that he's going to return, he's going to make everything new? Right? Is the promise of heaven still true or not? Are we still hanging on to that promise? Do we still live in the reality of that promise? Do our hearts burn for something greater and something even more peaceful than we know exists on this side of eternity? And do we believe that Jesus will return and make everything right and end all suffering? Right? Does that promise still remain? Does his promise, right, working through the holy sacraments of baptism and communion, his promise that there is forgiveness, the assurance of forgiveness, his spirit, his presence, does that still remain today for you and for me? Does his promise that his word will not return void, that it is living and active, does the promise of his power of his word still remain for you and for me? Does his promise that he is with us? He's with you. Right? Is that still a true promise, or has he walked away from you, or is he with you? Is he still working in all things for the good of his children? Right? Does that promise still remain? Does his promise that he hears our prayers and answers our prayers, does that still remain? Right? Does his promise of the Beatitudes still remain? That blessed are those who are peacemakers. Right? Are we blessed as peacemakers? Do we bring a blessing into this world when we offer peace in this world? Right? His promises, right, do they still remain for you and for me and for this world? Right? In the time that we live in, right, we see brokenness, we see war, not just rumors of war. Right? We see hurt, we see pain, we see sin. But yet, I do believe this, and I want to encourage you to look for this. Right? There is goodness. There is goodness. His presence still remains. His strength, his courage, his resilience, his perseverance that he's put inside of each of us, it still remains. And so I don't know what is tempting you these days to not believe that his promises remain, but please remember this. He fulfilled his promises, and he made even more promises, and his promises remain. And so may we move forward by faith, believing in his promises, leaning into his promises, living through his promises.